In 2016, an international smuggler was fined $9.8 million after taking golden kiwi sprouts to China. A few years earlier, thieves siphoned $18.4 million worth of Quebec's pure maple syrup. And in 2022, authorities caught smugglers transporting $2.2 million worth of these clear pearl lobster larvae from Indonesia to Singapore. A lot of the world's most expensive foods get smuggled.
So, depending on the strategy, all they need to do is get that price lower.
But some smugglers say they have legitimate reasons for illegally cashing in. So what leads to food smuggling? And how are governments and food producers fighting back? Food smugglers often 1. Exploit products with high demand, creating black markets. 2. Exploit environmental protections meant to limit supply. Or 3. Exploit specific household brands to make a profit. New Zealand's golden kiwis and Canada's maple syrup fall into this last category. They can't be grown by just anybody anywhere. This limits supply, keeps prices high, and attracts smugglers. Pure maple syrup was at the centre of one of Canada's biggest heists. In general, pure maple syrup is rare and time-consuming to make. A bottle of grade A maple syrup can cost over $40. That's almost 15 times as expensive as popular imitation syrup.
So table syrup, that is actually not maple syrup. It's usually corn syrup or cane syrup, maybe a little bit of maple flavoring added to it because it's not from a maple tree at all.
And while this syrup was tapped in New York, and this was tapped in Vermont, Canada produces the most maple syrup of any nation, with Quebec leading the way. Syrup from the province is heavily regulated by the organisation Quebec Maple Syrup Producers, also known simply as the Federation. The Federation sets the quality standards and the price for all maple syrup made in Quebec, but also sets quotas on how many trees producers can tap. The journalist Brendan Burrell reported on the maple syrup heist in Quebec in 2012.
At the time I was working on this article, there were about 7,000 farms that were producing maple syrup, and there was a waiting list of about 1,200 farms, and pretty much year after year they weren't adding anybody to the list.
These other farms weren't allowed to officially sell their syrup within the province, which led to an underground market. Farms in other Canadian provinces and the US were ready to buy this surplus syrup for cash. By this point, the Federation was already reserving about 10% of Quebec's production a year, housing it in a warehouse.
The floor is all sticky, and all these barrels are stacked like 6 high. Each barrel is worth, by the way, like about $1,200.
This ensured constant supply, even during a bad harvest year. But it also laid the foundation for the Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist.
Turned out there was an insider, a guy who rented space next door. Every evening he would let in the gang of rebels to come in and siphon out the maple syrup. In many cases they replaced the syrup with water so that nobody would notice, and then they drove away. And because there was already this kind of underground economy operating, they had people who were willing to buy the syrup and had sort of these trade routes to get it out of Quebec and out of Canada.
Between 2011 and 2012, 6 million gallons worth, $18.4 million was stolen from the warehouse.
So it put a dent on syrup demand, and farmers don't get paid until their syrup gets sold.
The heist didn't stop production, which continued to rise, but by then, the market had changed. Quebec wasn't the only player anymore. Between the introduction of the Federation's quotas in 2020, maple syrup production in Vermont increased by 264%.
Ultimately, this boils down to being an ideological debate. I mean, on the one side, you have this very controlled socialist system where, it's like all for one for all. We're going to agree to only sell this much and at this price because it benefits us as a group, versus sort of the free market philosophy.
A lot of our recommendations to governments are pull back on the laws. You want to control, you want to maintain safety, right? Consumer safety, you want to ensure fair trade, competition. That's what lowers prices, not artificially introducing excise taxes or different, laws that create differences between markets or across borders that facilitate smuggling, for example.
Another smuggling debate is happening across the globe between New Zealand and China, this time about a special fruit. The golden kiwi is a unique strain of kiwi fruit developed through crossbreeding to be sweeter and softer than a normal green kiwi. While green kiwis have a thick, hairy skin that provides a protective layer, golden kiwis are completely hairless and much more easily damaged. Even though they're smaller, golden kiwis cost almost twice as much as green kiwis. This particular variety of golden kiwi, called Smuggled, is controlled by Zespri, a cooperative of kiwi fruit growers in New Zealand. This perfected strain has an export value of 253 million New Zealand dollars. Growing golden kiwis is so lucrative that it's caused a feud between New Zealand and China, where the fruit is native, because not just anyone can grow these kiwis. Zespri only releases a certain number of licenses every year, and growers bid on them. In 2022, the median price for a Smuggled license hit $801,000 per hectare.
We have IP protections around who's able to grow it and who shouldn't be growing it. And gold kiwi fruit it's a handcrafted product. Yeah, we grow it in nature, but so many hours go into it. They get touched so much, and whether it be fertilisation, pruning, tying down the fruiting wood, thinning flowers, it just needs so much attention.
However, after a kiwi grower successfully smuggled Smuggled sprouts overseas, a number of illegal orchards popped up in China. The smuggler was fined 14 million New Zealand dollars in damages, but since then, the unauthorised Smuggled orchards have soared. So much so that at one point there were more illegal golden kiwis than legal ones. In 2022, China was growing 12,000 hectares of golden kiwis, and New Zealand 9,000. In 2023, Zespri estimated the numbers in China were back down to about 8,000. But Zespri is still fighting, and it's starting to take legal action against individual growers.
One of the things that comes to my mind when I see that is intellectual property rights aren't just limited to consumer products or electronics or clothing or handbags or watches. We think about that. But it's also a big aspect of innovation in the agricultural sector.
Here at Wiroa Orchard, located in Kerikeri in the heart of Northland, New Zealand, golden kiwis are carefully harvested with gloved hands. It can be 5 years before a new Smuggled kiwi orchard is ready for harvest. Most of the work is orchard care.
I don't think a lot of people actually understand how much labour and work goes into creating the product that they're eating.
That's a significant loss of revenue to these corporations. In addition, their brand is being jeopardized, right? They've invested a lot to do that. And then someone comes along and steals it. Most importantly, all that time was put into developing that seed. The consumer buys that seed, there's no logo on it. Their IP is at risk. And what's that say to other developers? You try to develop something new and you think, well, why bother if it's just going to be stolen the next day?
Sometimes there's no ideological debate. Smugglers see foods with high demand and take shortcuts. That's what happened with pearl lobsters, fish maw, and stockfish, each of which had their own black market. Stockfish is cod that's dried by cold air and wind without using salt, and the market has all the qualities that entice smugglers. First, stockfish has to be imported. Due to Nigeria's hot and humid climate, stockfish has to be dried here in Norway, where there are entire operations dedicated to the seafood. Second, it's expensive. A full drying rack like this is worth over $500,000, and it sells for $65 per kilogram. 7 times as much as other popular fish like croaker. Third, the demand is high.
No, this call from Norway. We don't have challenge selling Stockfish when we import it, and we sell as much as we bring.
In Nigeria, we love stockfish a lot.
That's Abby Cheke. She's the fisheries consultant at the Norwegian Seafood Council.
The production is limited in Norway, and in Nigeria we are over 200 million people. And I would say out of these 200 million people, at least 60% are adults who eat this product. So we can never have enough brought in.
In 2015, Nigeria imported $8.94 million worth of stockfish from Norway. But how does the black market work?
No, stockfish normally comes through the Nigerian ports, and the duty on stockfish heads is 10%, on stockfish body is 20%, because we see stockfish body as a luxury food product, mainly for the elite.
Those import duties are reflected in the final price the consumer pays, making the product more expensive. To evade these duties, smugglers started operating in Nigeria's neighbouring countries and then smuggled the fish over land borders.
A lot of that is tax arbitration. So you have 2 neighboring countries, one country has a higher tax, one country has a lower tax. So they can move products between one country or the other and avoid the taxes, thereby charging a slightly lower price to the consumer. And that's what drives smuggling.
Those that paid the duty, they were selling like 65,000 naira per bag of 30 kilos. And those that comes in illegally, black marketers through the land borders, would actually sell at 50,000 naira. So you can see a disparity of 15,000 naira.
To fight smuggling, Nigeria closed its land borders in 2019, easing trade for many dealers. Roughly 10,000 metric tons of stockfish entered Nigeria in the years leading up to 2023.
Before the federal government of Nigeria closed its land borders, I would have said we would have had about 45% of that 10,000 tons coming illegally into Nigeria. But within these past 2 years, I'll say illegality of stockfish trade through the closed land borders will just be about 3 to 5%.
But Abby says the most important move Nigeria made was simplifying the legal process for importing stockfish and making sure traders understood just how simple the process could be.
That's why they say awareness, information is power.
This awareness is making a difference. Abby says there are now 150,000 people involved in the stockfish trade, up from 90,000 when the black market was operating. While Nigerians love stockfish, Chinese consumers across the globe can't get enough of fish maw, and that high demand has led to a growing black market. It's this balloon-like internal organ known as a fish maw or a swim bladder. Fish maw is traditionally considered one of the 4 treasures of Cantonese cuisine, along with shark fin, abalone and sea cucumber.
所以咧，佢嘅年份咧越耐咧，佢嘅花膠係越厚，跟住咧佢所含嘅膠原同埋蛋白質咧係非常之豐富，同埋咧佢所含咧各種嘅微生物咧、磷咧、鈣咧呢啲微生物特別豐富啲。
Dried fish maws can sell for up to $800 a pound. But older maws like this one, from a large slate cod croaker, are valued as high as $4,000 for a single piece. But the supply chain in China is facing a big problem. Fish maw is so prized that Chinese waters have been overfished, leading to new limits preventing local fishers from catching and selling. Today, the majority of fish maw is imported from other countries, including Uganda, where fishing for an invasive species called Nile perch on Lake Victoria has become a lucrative business for locals.
Because I fish because I need fish more. Because fish more is like gold from my side. You understand? We used to throw it back. We used to throw the bladder because it was no sense. We wanted that meat, but nowadays, money.
In just 5 years, from 2014 to 2019, the fish maw trade in Uganda grew from $35 million to $76 million. The organ is so prized that smuggling and theft are rampant in the industry. Fishers like Amber Francis place their bait in the water and come back later to check their catches. Each hook is demarcated with a bottle, so he knows which lines belong to him. But smugglers have learned that too.
Unfortunately, you go there, you find nothing, when everything was taken by those thieves. Yeah.
This is a huge loss for fishers who have already made a big investment to get into the trade. Not everyone can afford the initial investment of equipment, which includes a government-licensed boat, an engine, plus regulation hooks and bait.
Yeah, actually, it requires a lot of capital. Yeah, to deal in fishing Nalpash. Like me as a fisherman, just one boat I require like 15 million shillings.
Smugglers, on the other hand, operate without a license and keep their fishing costs much lower, maximizing profits.
The vessels that these people go out in are barely seaworthy, right? So their costs right from the beginning on capital are low.
Crime is also an issue on land. Hakeem says some of his colleagues have been robbed while transporting their goods to Chinese buyers.
Theft is too much. Most on the roads when you're taking it to the Chinese.
Because of the regulations and pricey entry into the trade in Uganda, some fishers like David Oliabo have given up on Nile perch and the fish maw trade completely and turned to cage farming as a safer investment and a cheaper alternative.
In fish farming, you are sure that at least at the end of the season, you will harvest this. You expect, you have projections, you plan. But as a fisherman, you don't plan. You go, you don't know what you get. It's a game of chances.
While the Nile perch in Lake Victoria is considered an invasive species, for years fish maw has been linked to the illegal fishing of endangered species worldwide. A large croaker in Mexico's Gulf of California called the totoaba is now in danger of extinction. But this fish, often dubbed the cocaine of the sea, is still illegally trafficked into China. In April 2023, US Customs seized $2.7 million worth of totoaba fish maw hidden in a shipment of frozen fish fillets in Arizona. In Indonesia, smugglers are after something much smaller to the eye. These tiny clear larvae are pearl lobsters. An adult lobster can cost nearly $100 a kilogram, 6 times as expensive as other popular varieties like Maine lobsters. They're known for their blue-green shells, rainbow-coloured spots, and extra long antennae.
Rasanya ini yang mungkin membuatnya populer dari lobster yang lain. Rasanya itu agak-agak manis dan gurih, enak, dan kalau digoreng itu rasanya pokoknya mantap dah.
Pearl lobsters are found throughout the Indian Ocean and West Pacific, from Africa to northern Australia. But the waters around Indonesia are where their largest communities exist, like here in Ekas Bay. The demand for Indonesian lobsters, particularly pearl lobsters, is very high in countries like Singapore, China, and Vietnam. Wild pearl lobsters are always more expensive because they tend to be larger than their captive counterparts.
Sebab itu kalau di bulan Januari sampai Februari itu nyampe dia sampai 1.500.000 per kilogram untuk yang alam. Sementara di bulan lain mungkin berkisar antara 1 juta atau 1.150.000 itu saja kan.
They're not available year-round, so Indonesia started farming them. It's not an easy job, but it can be very profitable.
Saya tertarik karena hasilnya sangat mendukung untuk keluarga kami, keluarga saya gitu, untuk membiayai sekolah anak saya dan kebutuhan lain-lainnya.
Breeders like Merdim raise pearl lobsters in captivity. This method ensures a more reliable supply of lobsters. But keeping them healthy is no easy feat. The lobster larvae, or seeds as they're called, are placed in nets that float directly in the ocean, exposed to natural elements.
Ya memang agak sulit dan agak susah lobster mutiara itu dibudidayakan karena agak rentan penyakitnya, mudah kena diserang penyakit lah gitu, dan terlalu mahal bibitnya juga.
But perhaps even riskier, they're exposed to smugglers. Large suitcases of larvae are smuggled to Singapore and from there exported to Vietnam and China. Singapore is asking its lobster traders for clearer paperwork, but the illegal activity doesn't seem to stop. A suitcase seized in May 2024 had over $300,000 worth of larvae. The smugglers are facing an 8-year prison sentence and a $92,000 fine. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. The Indonesian government estimates that in 2019 alone, it lost more than $64 million in revenue to illegal exports. Indonesian authorities have been trying to tackle the issue for years, banning exports of all lobster larvae in 2016 and again in 2021, but that didn't stop smugglers. In autumn 2022, authorities caught smugglers transporting $2.2 million worth of lobster larvae. In 2024, Indonesia decided to resume exports to capitalize on global trade. Exports are only open to Vietnam, which relies solely on imported larvae for its lobster farms. Indonesia is expected to receive $1.2 billion from Vietnam for the larvae. While maple syrup and golden kiwis are limited by quotas to localised production, other foods need quotas to be saved from extinction. That's the case with Spanish baby eels, but smugglers disregard those limits. Angulas are the young of the European eel. They are a delicacy in Spain where every year they're auctioned off for thousands of dollars. This kilogram of baby eels has just sold for over $7,000. And while angulas are prized for their crunchy texture, they have a very mild taste, almost non-existent.
Lo que hace a la angula tan especial es la finura que tiene en boca a la hora de comer.
But angulas are tiny. Fishers need to catch 3,000 of them to reach 1 kilo, a task that requires spending entire nights in the water, in total darkness, braving strong tides and stormy seas.
Con eso si cojo al final de la noche 50 gramos, ya son.
Eel scarcity is the result of years of overfishing. It's estimated that the European eel population has declined by 95% since the 80s. Many countries have set strict fishing quotas in response to this decline. Eel fishing here in Riba de Seja is heavily regulated. Fishers like Manolo are only allowed to fish baby eels between November and February, with 5 mandatory rest days each month. Each fisher needs to hold a license, and certain beaches are no fishing zones. Breaking any of these rules can cost as much as €6,000. These regulations mean that the price of angulas has skyrocketed in recent decades.
Cuando empecé a pescar con mi padre, yo llegué a vender la angula lo más barato a 8.000, 10.000, 12.000 pesetas de la época. Y ahora en las últimas campañas lo llegamos a vender hasta 810, fue lo máximo que vendí, el kilo, 810 euros.
Manolo has been fishing eels for the last 33 years. He's one of 46 fishers here in Riba de Seja who are licensed to fish angulas. But smugglers are making things difficult. Despite the quotas, eels are still fished illegally. In 2017, Spanish police uncovered an international trafficking operation headed for China, which included €2 million worth of angulas. Between 2022 and 2023, Europol arrested 256 people responsible for trafficking an estimated 13 million euros worth of baby eels. This uncertainty is pushing up the price for legally caught angulus even further. The first day auctions generate a lot of buzz, with chefs arriving from all over Spain to make their bids, but it's unclear if the seasons to come will be able to support this rise in demand. The European eel is listed as critically endangered, and fewer baby eels arrive at the beaches of Riba de Sella each year.
Llevo hacía 33 años que no perdí ninguno. Y sí es cierto que si miras a los años de atrás, de 10, de 15, de 20 años, las capturas bajaron. También bajaron los pescadores.
Not all baby eels cost over 7,000 euros. Cost is variable depending on the time of the year. That's why, for fishers like Manolo, it's impossible to rely on just angular fishing for a living.
El primer día, la subasta del primer día, económicamente para mí no supone mucho. Lo importante son los 3 meses y 29 días restantes.
In the last 50 years, the demand for the increasingly scarce eels has risen so much that gulas, a cheaper copy of baby eels, were born. Gulas are made of surimi, the same fish paste used to make imitation crab, and cost 62 times less than angulas. They are now just as popular as the real thing. Smuggling doesn't just worsen environmental problems like overfishing, it also causes them. Smuggled produce can carry invasive pests that damage crops.
There's a real-life example right now going on in California with fruit fly outbreaks, which have been some of the worst outbreaks that we've seen in 70 years.
California started fighting the fruit fly in the 60s, and since then, things have only gotten worse. In 2023, the infestation got so bad, some 79 square miles of Los Angeles County were placed under quarantine. The fly is native to Asia. It's unclear which fruit brought it to California, but authorities believe it may have been introduced by travelers or by mail. These pests don't just damage crops. They also damage trade relationships between countries.
Invasive species in general are expected to have about a $40 million impact on U.S. agriculture here on an annual basis, and that's just here in the United States. Across the world, the United Nations expects that invasive species has about a $220 billion impact and loses about $220 billion worth of exportability just by the presence of invasive species.